Hello and welcome back to NPTEL, the National Program on Technology Enhanced Learning. We are in now in the fourth lecture, in lecture 5 of module 1. Module 1, as you know, is introductory in nature, and these lectures are being brought to you by a joint venture by the Indian Institutes of Technology and the Indian Institute of Science. These lectures are for the students of in different engineering colleges and IITs, and where humanities and social sciences courses are offered as elective courses, and our course is, as you know, entitled Cultural Studies. And in these 3 or 4 lectures, we are looking at the contribution of science and what light science has to show to throw on culture. And in the lecture before this, we looked at evolutionary psychology, and we saw that evolutionary psychology, through its 5 principles as given to us by Leda Cosmides and John Tooby, can tell us a lot about why we have the kind of minds that we have and what our minds are actually for and how our minds have developed. We had looked at how evolutionary psychology is has a reverse engineering methodology, and we saw in the main that our minds are actually made to solve adaptive problems in the past, right? However, in today's lecture, we are looking at the origins of the modern mind. We are not looking at the prehistoric mind, at the mind as it evolved, but we are looking at really our target here is the modern mind, and we are going to look through it to at the modern mind and its origins through 3 transitional phases as given to us by the scholar Merlin Donald. But as always, we are going to, before that, look at some of the points we discussed in the last lecture. So as we go through the recap, you will recall that evolutionary psychology is really not a branch of psychology, but it is an approach to psychology where knowledge and principles from evolutionary biology are used to do research on the structure of the human mind. Next, we also saw that our minds, our information processing, our mind is comprised of information processing sets of information processing units or circuits, and the job is to solve certain kinds of problems. These problems we call adaptive information processing problems, and there are many problems, all right, but there are 4 core problems that we may zoom in to, and we can see that these problems are those that were there in our evolutionary history, and interestingly they are also with us today. So those problems we saw in the last lecture were those of face recognition, threat interpretation, language, and navigation. Then a quick recap of the 5 principles of evolutionary psychology as were given to us by Leda Cosmides and John Tooby in their primer on evolutionary psychology. The first went like this: the brain is a physical system. It functions as a computer. Its circuits are designed to generate behavior that is appropriate to your environmental circumstances. We also saw the second principle as given to us by Tooby and Cosmides as, and I quote, "Our neural circuits were designed by natural selection to solve problems that our ancestors faced during our species' evolutionary history," which is to acknowledge the fact that our circuits were designed by a principle, by a force, if you will, which is the one that was so elegantly formulated by Charles Darwin in the 19th century, which is the force of natural selection. And these circuits were designed to solve not current day problems, but problems that were faced by our ancestors in our evolutionary history. Next, the third principle of evolutionary psychology we saw had to do with consciousness, and we saw consciousness as both awareness, also as our subjective experience. We also saw that consciousness may be considered as our wakefulness. Okay. Anyhow, no matter what definition we adopt of consciousness, the point that was made by evolutionary psychology was this: that consciousness is just the tip of the iceberg. Most of what goes on in your mind is hidden from you. I'm so sorry. Is hidden from you. As a result, your conscious experience can mislead you into thinking that your circuit is very simple, for instance. Okay, so we saw with the example of how what goes that we saw that there are a number of processes that go into the very simple, seemingly simple process or act of recognizing one's own mother. There are inputs from definitely the visual system, from memory, from various other systems, and the point was to argue that all these all these processes that go into that act of recognizing one's mother, or anyone for that matter, are thousands in number, are hundreds in number, and these are hidden from us. And I had said that we can very well speculate that the reason why these are hidden from us is because we do not really need to know them in order to survive, and there would have been an information overload, okay, if we were to really be aware or conscious of all the processes that give us the final results, or what Tooby and Cosmides had called the high level conclusions or perceptions. Next, the fourth principle of evolutionary psychology we saw was this: different neural circuits are specialized for solving different adaptive problems. And we had discussed this. We had said that like as in engineering, where an all-purpose machine is no good. For instance, a hammer cannot do the job of a saw. Okay, like in the human body, for instance, okay, there are various organs devoted to different kinds of specialization. For instance, the liver is devoted to detoxification, then the lungs for respiration, the heart for pumping blood, etc. Following evolutionary biology, we also in evolutionary psychology we argue that our neural circuits are specialized for solving different problems. Okay, there may be overlaps, scientists may have found overlaps, okay, but the point is there definitely are circuits that are specialized for doing different jobs. Then we saw the last principle was very again eloquently put as our modern skulls house a Stone Age mind, and we saw that it means this, that even in our modern forms, okay, even as we have a modern form or we live in modern times, the mind that we have is one that was sculpted, as the metaphor used by Tooby and Cosmides. This was like wind, sculpting a piece of rock, for instance, okay, for thousands of years. And well, why not? Because it seems that 99% of our species evolutionary history, right, was spent in hunter-gatherer societies, right, and the all the rest of it, the beginning of agriculture, for instance, the computer age, the industrial revolution before it, right, all these are, as the authors say, simply like the like the blink of an eye when compared to the enormous amount of time, okay, spent. They say it is 1,000 times more than any time spent in any stage of evolution. Okay, so 99% of our species evolutionary history was spent in the hunter-gatherer stage, and we have minds that are essentially, okay, even if they do produce or perform very sophisticated tasks like mathematics, for instance, like high literature, very good literature, for instance, like music, for instance, okay, and very complicated, complex tasks, it still is a fact that many in fact argue that these are perhaps byproducts of the original, of the original tasks, right, that our brains were sort of sculpted for, right. So our modern skulls house a Stone Age mind, and the fact is that those core adaptive problems like face recognition, like navigation, okay, remember, like threat interpretation, and also things like the raising of children, gathering of food, etc. All these are things that have not, and perhaps, well, we may speculate, are not going to leave us. They are going to be with us in as far as survival and reproduction in the Darwinian paradigm are accepted as the goals, so to speak, okay, towards which our brains were designed. Fine. So the topic of discussion now is, as we saw, the modern mind, and I think it's fitting that this is the next lecture in our series, the modern mind and its origins. And the key source text in this lecture is by Merlin Donald, his work, The Origins of the Modern Mind. Let me add a caveat here. See, it is not that this is the only narrative, so to speak, of the development and the origin and the development of the modern mind. Okay, there may be different there may be different findings as work goes on, or there may have been others who delineate or describe a different set of transitional phases. Okay, one reason why I brought this text here is that it is quite an accepted text now, and if we have to see, because it is a linear narrative, okay, it has three phases. If we have to see or look at the story of the origin of the modern mind as a narrative, then we cannot have too many overlapping and contradictory texts, right. So I begin with the caveat that perhaps some of the findings will change, but it is enough for us to know, because we are not exactly focusing on prehistory and anthropology here. We are trying to look at a text that is going to give us some knowledge about how culture was formed, right. So let's see how this narrative has been woven together by Merlin Donald. Okay. The central argument in Donald's text is this, and that is why we need, since we are doing cultural studies, we need this text. Human beings have evolved a completely novel cognitive strategy compared to other animals, okay, and this cognitive strategy is our brain culture symbiosis. Okay, this is also known as co-evolution, right. We have a whole theory of co-evolution, and this strategy is one that was developed singularly by the humans, by Homo sapiens, by the human species. So we have a brain culture symbiosis, meaning we have the physical feeding into the cultural feeding into the physical, and it's a co-evolution, and that is why we need to know this narrative. Then Donald says, as a consequence, the human brain cannot realize its design potential unless it is immersed in a distributed communication network that is a culture during its development. This is immensely important. Okay, look at this. He calls culture a distributed communication network. Now, because, okay, now I will unpack his words, and I'm going to speak about the point that he wants to make here. It is that because the evolution was a symbiotic one, okay, the evolution was not simply one to do with the brain and only physical pressures or environmental pressures, topographical pressures. The point being made is the human brain today right, it cannot realize, that is, even it cannot sort of manifest and achieve its true potential, right, without being immersed in culture. It is all because we have sort of developed with culture and brain, with the relationship of brain and culture, with the physical and the cultural, right, we cannot achieve our, you know, full potential unless we are in a culture, okay. And that is why it is important for us, you know, before we go on in other modules, to look at more modern forms of culture, to look at modern cultural practices, to look at the key concepts, the sites of cultural studies, right. It is important for us to ask this question: we have a mind that has developed culture. How was this mind, okay, how was culture developed through a mind, and how did this very mind develop? And one of the things that we saw was, of course, in evolutionary psychology, and how really our essential propensities are for our core, you know, core evolutionary problems like face recognition, etc. Here Donald gives us another point, and that is, he points to the fact that the brain developed with culture, and culture developed along with brain development. That is why we need to see the origin of the modern mind. Then he says the human brain is quite literally, specifically, this is important, specifically adapted for functioning in a complex symbolic culture. This is very important, okay. We have something called symbolic thought. What is symbolic thought? And you will see in, when we discuss in towards the end of this module, when we talk about structuralism as a school of thought, as a theory, we will see that a capacity for symbolic thought, that is a capacity for you know, cognizing the world, retaining things about the world in our memory using symbols, is a major breakthrough, right? Is not only of course not only a major breakthrough in our evolutionary history, it is also one that eventually allowed us to have mathematics, eventually allowed us to have language, okay. Later on you will come to know how you know, language is based on the fact that words are arbitrary, right? Words and there is no one-to-one correspondence between a word and the object that it refers to. For instance, this pen that I am holding here, there is nothing, there is no relation between the word pen and this object that I am holding. Is there something pen-like about this, you know, this object that calls out to us to call it a pen? Okay, it is. There are different words in different languages for a pen, and that is proof of the fact that the relation between the pen and the word pen, the object pen and the word pen, is one that is arbitrary. This kind of arbitrariness would not have been possible had we not developed symbolic thought. So symbolic thought is immensely important, and again, symbols and signs and signifying practices, as we shall see over the next few lectures, okay, are really the foundational topics in cultural studies. So let's read again. The human brain is quite literally, specifically adapted for functioning in a complex symbolic culture. So as I said, symbolic thought is one that is if not thoroughly, completely peculiar to us as a species, it is still something that has allowed us to have a very complex culture, very complex forms of knowledge, beginning with the alphabet and the number systems. Okay, fine. So this work by Merlin Donald about the story of the origin of the modern mind and it being, you know, and culture being a very important part of it, okay, hinges itself on three major transformations, right? And he declares this in the beginning, really, and he says that this entire development through a brain culture symbiosis has to be seen or studied under three major transformations throughout you know, prehistory and history. The first transition, and I will explain all of these through his work. The first transition is called is something that entailed a kind of skill known as mimetic skill and auto-cueing. These are the two features of the first phase, okay, mimetic skill and autocueing. The second transition involved in the main, or at least its major feature, was lexical invention, and the third transition was the externalization of memory. Okay, so what are the three transitions? That the first transition involved two important features, mimetic skill and autocueing. Second transition, lexical invention, and third, here memory is externalized, and this entire essay will be devoted to these three transformations. Okay, and then the effect of the transformations, which I again point to towards the end, the effects were these: that there were three new uniquely human systems of memory representation. This is important. Okay, compared to other species, we developed a new novel unique system of how memory was going to be represented. And another effect was there were three interwoven layers, right? These are three interwoven layers of human culture, each supported by its corresponding set of representation. Okay, look at this. There was a different way, okay, different systems that developed through brain culture symbiosis of memory representation, and there were interwoven layers of human culture where we find each of these stages had their own representative systems or systems of representation, right? So let's see how this happens. Okay, then selection pressures, as Merlin Dolan says, and I'm reading from his text, selection pressures at the stage of human evolution were ultimately expressed and tested on the socio-cultural level. This is why we need to look at the story that I have talked about, the story of the origin of the modern mind. Okay, because in evolution the changes were physical, all right, okay, but as he says, where is the manifestation of this? The manifestation, where is the evidence from it? How do we glean the evidence? The evidence is gleaned from the socio-cultural level, and they were tested that these selection pressures and these evolutionary adaptations, that they are established, that they are there to stay, and that they are beneficial for the species, were finally, as he said, tested on the level of the socio-cultural. Then he says the evolution, this is important, okay, the evolutionary scenario can be described as a series of cultural adaptations. Now this is really a new way of of describing things, right, a new way of formulating things. For instance, we always whenever we talk about evolution, whenever we talk about Darwinian theory, we think that these are to do with only evolution or changes at the physical level. Okay, now we have a scholar who's telling us that these are also at the same time cultural adaptations. So the evolutionary scenario can be described as a series of cultural adaptations, even though individual cognition was really where the main event was taking place. Okay, so that is why we are going to look at these changes also as cultural changes, not even if they're happening in the brain and in the body. Okay, these are not simply to be read only as or considered only as biological physical changes. Okay, then the essay says the most important evolutionary steps were concentrated into a few transition periods when the process of change was greatly accelerated, and there are to begin with, okay, one very important point here, which is the increase in the size of the brain, and I would like to spend some time talking about this here. Okay, there is something called the East Side Story, which you have heard of. The East Side Story, as you know, holds that the human species, okay, the human race, originated in Africa. Okay, after a geological catastrophe which we call the Great Rift Valley, which separated the eastern part of Africa from the western part, as there was a formation of a valley, and through up a it threw up a set of mountains which separated the eastern side of Africa from the western side, and our origins go back to the eastern side, which was arid, which was dry, and when we came down from trees and when we developed bipedalism or walking on 2 feet, okay, and eventually we took to meat eating, okay. We took to meat eating, which led to a protein rich diet, okay, which had enormous implications as far as the development of the brain was concerned, right. Meat eating led to a protein rich diet, and it led to an increase in the size of the brain, right. So it is not that there was only one increase in the size of the brain. Scientists tell us that there were several perhaps increases in the size of the brain, but one major breakthrough came about with bipedalism, with hunting for food, okay, with an increase in the size of the human brain following a protein rich diet. A second very important physical anatomical change was the descent of the larynx, okay. The larynx you will find in the apes, okay, in our cousins are slightly higher up, right, whereas our larynx of Homo sapiens are down here, right. So if you look at this here slide, right, so if this, okay, so there was a descent of the larynx, okay, which created, as linguists and people who study anatomy and linguistics would say, that there was a peculiar geometry being formed here, right, which we call the inverted L. This is, or here, the inverted L. The inverted L gave a peculiar geometry to to us, and it enabled a repertoire of vowel sounds, right, which this descent of the larynx therefore was immensely important for what? For the beginning of language, right, with the repertoire of sounds was more than that available to our ape cousins, right. So what are the 2 points here? To begin with, increase in the size of the brain and descent of the larynx. Both you have to understand, according to Donald and other scholars, both had immense implications for the development of culture, okay. Language is a part of culture, okay. Our hunting skills, our communication skills are part, our symbolic thought are what go into the building of culture, right. These are traced to the increase in the size of the brain and the descent of the larynx. And you have to remember that this this happened together, what we saw a while ago, a couple of slides ago, where Merlin Donald calls it a brain culture symbiosis, right. So a rapid increase in brain size happened in the first case, okay. In the first case, in initial stage, the increase was not everywhere. The increase was concentrated in 3 areas. Now let's look at these according to Donald. These 3 areas are the association cortex, the hippocampus, and the cerebellum. It is so interesting if you look at this, the association cortex, as it increased in size, it enabled it is something that is responsible for complex perception, okay. So an increase in the association complex, it is speculated, okay, gave us the possibility, or it created the possibility for complex perception. Now hippocampus, an increase in the in the brain, in the site of the hippocampus, which is responsible for memory, enabled us to also it increased our capacity for memory. And finally cerebellum, increase in this site, also gave us balance and posture. Now if you look at the story here very carefully, balance and posture are required for skill in balance and posture are required for bipedalism, or standing on 2 feet. Before this, we were not standing on 2 feet, right. It was a development in in evolution, in our evolutionary history. Before this, what we had was we were walking on all fours, and like as you see in chimpanzees, etc., they do something called knuckle walking, right? So they walk on their knuckles. Now, as there was pressure given an arid situation in the eastern part of Africa, given a situation where they had to hunt for food, they took to meat eating as part of the diet, right? Given such a feature, it was necessary that there should be bipedalism. And with bipedalism, what happened was there was a freeing of the hands, because you are no longer knuckle walking. There is a freeing of the hands, and with the freeing of the hands, as scholars tell us, there was what we call the beginning of the gradual, beginning of the opposable thumb. That is, the thumb is opposable as compared to our ape cousins, is opposable to a great degree from the other four fingers. Now, let me elaborate on this. Because it has immense implications for culture, right? What happens when slowly the thumb is opposed to the four fingers is that you get two kinds of grip, right? Extremely important for our first tools, for our first technology. This grip is the power grip, okay, to be able to hold an implement, right? The other grip is the precision grip, to be able to do things, to make implements with a certain degree of precision. Now, if you notice carefully, without an opposable thumb, it is not possible to have either a power grip or a precision grip. So this opposable thumb is what gave us the first culture. So you see the relationship between physical change and cultural change, right? And then we began to hunt in groups. We began, to communicate more among ourselves. We developed language. With language, we developed words. With words, you need more memory to store, and also to store other kinds of hunting strategies, right? Where you did hunt yesterday, for instance, okay, and for complex perceptions. When one needed to survive, then one had to change, and for that we need a brain that had to accommodate all these changes. And the increase in brain size came about, as scholars say, with the eating of eating of meat. So there's so many forces, really, so interesting. The story is so beautiful. So many changes that came about together, right, in a brain, what Donald calls a brain culture symbiosis. So the cultural evidence. Now, if you ask me, or ask the scholars, how do you know that this happened, right? So the cultural evidence is that we do find sophisticated stone tools, okay, in places where archaeologists or paleontologists paleontology is the study of fossils, have been to or do their work and make excavations. There is evidence of long distance hunting strategies, and of course of migration out of Africa. So this is the cultural evidence that we have. Remember what Donald had said, Merlin Donald says, that eventually all these changes that happen in adaptation to the body, okay, these changes were ultimately what he calls realized or manifested or become evident at the cultural level. And that is why, remember, he calls this a series of evolution, a series of cultural adaptations. This certainly is another way, a novel way of looking at the story of evolution. So the second major transition, as we saw, was by another large brain expansion, and at the same time the descent of the larynx. This is something we have already discussed. The descent of the larynx is important. Why? Because it led to two things. One is, it led to a high-speed vocal communication system and a large lexicon. Remember, the lexical invention is an important part in stage 2. And so there was, what is a lexicon? As you know, a lexicon is a dictionary, is a collection of words, right? So there were new inventions, and there were additions to the lexicon or to the set of a set of words and terms and symbols that were there in our ancestors' minds, stored in our ancestors' brains, and also concurrently there was a high-speed vocal communication system that grew along, along with this, right? Now we will look at what happens to to apes. Why they didn't, why is it that apes did not achieve this level? A very important point here is apes are our cousins, all right, in the evolutionary story, but apes have something, a memory system which Donald calls an episodic memory system. Okay, this will lead us to an important change in the first transformation. Apes have a memory system which is episodic in nature. That is, they do not have easy recall without environmental cues, right? As Donald says here, they are even brilliant even perceivers, right? But they have episodic memory and very poor episodic recall, as they cannot self-trigger their memories. This is very important. They need environmental cues, okay? So in case you are wondering why apes did not develop as we do, and they have a different evolutionary trajectory after we split from our common ancestor. Remember, we did not evolve from apes. This is very important for us to remember. We evolved, into a common ancestor, and then there was a bifurcation, and therefore apes cannot, they cannot express knowledge, even gestures or minds to communicate even the simplest of intention. They need several rehearsals. There is hundreds of rehearsals, it seems, to be able to be able to do something without a cue. So the first transition therefore involved two things: mimesis and voluntary retrievability. Voluntary retrievability, is something we saw that apes do not have. So we developed something called auto cueing, that is cueing without the need for any cues, that is auto, self, right? So we developed a voluntary retrievability because of selection pressures, and also mimesis. Mimesis, is a Greek word. The mimetic skill comes from mimesis, the Greek word meaning imitation. So these are the two things that we have, and let's read from what Donald has to say. According to Donald, two fundamentally new cognitive features developed: a supramotor modeling capacity called mimesis, which created representations that had the critical property of voluntary retrievability. This is the first stage in the story of the development. Now, therefore, we see that the main logic for the first transition is based on several premises. That is a revolution in the modeling system, right? Hominids were able to use the whole body as a representational device, okay, to mime or to imitate things in using the entire body. Remember, we do not have language at that stage, right? So the entire body was used to represent things, and there was a self-triggered rehearsal loop, meaning there was an auto-cueing system which was self-triggered, which did not need any cues. Okay, so that if you are in, if you want to remember an event that had happened elsewhere, you do not need to again go to that place to trigger the memories. You can trigger your memories at will. Then, okay, at this stage, the Homo erectus when we did not have language, we are not yet in the second stage, right? Homo erectus, our species, had something called proto-language. Now, proto-language is what Donald calls a limited degree of linguistic capacity. Okay, it's not full-fledged language. Proto-language would mean two-word sentences, for instance, and we compare it to the utterances of a child, a 2-year-old child, for instance, depending on the child's development. How the child tries to communicate with his parents or others using just 2 words, right, where there is no sense of syntax, really, no sense of grammar, right? So this linguistic capacity, this very limited linguistic capacity, was something that was developed by the time the second stage would begin, and this was important and it helped in tool making and social coordination. Now, there is going to be the descent of the larynx, which did what? If you remember, it gave a great push to phonological system of producing sounds, okay, through what Donald calls a high-speed phonological system. And second, there was lexical invention, the addition of more and more words into the repertoire. So therefore, auto-cueing, as we saw, required no environmental cueing and is something that distinguishes us as a species. So the socio-cultural implications of mimetic action, that is, remember, mimetic action is the using of the entire body as a representational device. What happened was there was a dramatic increase, right? Donald calls it a dramatic increase in the variability of facial, vocal and whole body expressions, as well as in the range of potential scenarios between individuals. Second, there was a quasi-symbolic communication to create a very simple shared semantic environment in Donald's words. Now, the second phase added two more features, and we have seen this: capacity for lexical invention and a high-speed phonological apparatus. This is, why this is important for culture. Particularly, it is important for, it is the rudiments of, rudimentary system which goes into the creation of myths, and B, to the creation of, ultimately to the creation of literature, for instance, okay, of stories, right? It is important for us from the cultural studies point of view because it gave us a narrative thought, right? So, as Donald says here, the natural collective product of language was narrative thought, essentially storytelling, which evolved for specific social purposes and serves essentially similar purposes in modern society, right? To be, simple narrative, to be able to kind of articulate things in a linear sort of way. This happened, and then that happened, and then the following happened. To add causality to it, this happened, then that happened, and because of that, a third thing happened. Do you follow? Okay. So this kind of linking things into narrative thought is because you had, there's an extension of what he calls the lexical skill and to the labeling of relationships, the arbitrary labeling of relationships between words, and this collective product of language, language, growth of language, of words, of the of the phonological system was a very important capacity we had apart from the symbolic capacity, and this symbolic thought, and this capacity is narrative thought, which gave us our first myths. Then the sociocultural ramifications now of this second phase was that it increased the number and complexity of available words and grammars. Okay, obviously there's going to be a syntax now. If you need a linear and a causal system of representing events, then you would obviously need a grammar, right? You need a syntax in which to arrange those thoughts, and there has to be an increase even in the number, right? In the number of words. And as Donald says, it altered human culture by introducing a new level of shared representation. Remember, the level of shared representation in the first phase was a level that played out in the body, right? It was where the body was used as a representational device. Remember, mimetic skill. But now what happens was we have an entirely new level of shared representation which had enormous implications for the development of culture. It was not bodily, right, but it was spoken. Okay, it was language based. So this is why we call it a new stage, and I think Donald rightly calls it. There's no denying the fact that the descent of the larynx and along with another growth, increase in the size of the brain was an important second transformational phase. Next, we come to transition number 3, the third important transition in the development of culture along with selection pressures, and this is very interesting. This is external memory storage and retrieval and a new working memory architecture. What is meant by external memory, right? In this scheme, external memory, it is quite obvious. It is what I have in front of me. Okay, I am not giving this lecture, or I am not, I'm not talking to you simply from my own memory, right? I do not need this if I am going to talk to you. Base my recollection from my internal memory, the memory that is there inside my brain, right? So the third stage is important in this. It's a relatively new stage. It is that we no longer rely only on our internal memory system to store our knowledge, to store the procedures of how things may be done, right? We have external storage in the sense we have books, right? So if I go out shopping, I carry a list with me. That list is not, in my internal memory. It is on a piece of paper, which is the external memory, right? So external memory storage and retrieval. The CDs where we, the hard disks where we, the external disks, or the computer disks where we keep our things. Anywhere where we store our knowledge, and and not in, so that there's knowledge grows so fast that our internal memory definitely, obviously cannot store, the normal human brain cannot store so much material in its internal memory. So in the third phase, as Donald says, in the development of the origin of the modern human mind and the development and change in culture, is that we began to store things, outside of our internal memory into what we call our external memory system. And therefore there is a new memory architecture. Why? Because they say there are two fields now. One is your internal memory, okay, and one is the external memory, which is an extended field for your memory, working architecture of the memory. I will not go into this a lot, because the second thing, this new working memory structure, is something a person from psychology would be able to explain to you better. Nevertheless, the important point is, in the third transition, or the third transition is marked by the development and growth of various kinds of devices for external storage of memory. So now Donald says that what happens with this external storage of memory is that there is a wide range of new possibilities, right? Possibilities to do with not simply storage, okay, of data, right, but also the way data is now processed. Remember, he said that there is a new working, there's a new working memory architecture, right? And hence there are new possibilities or ways of processing, not only of processing, but also the way we retrieve things. Since we are not retrieving directly from our own internal memory, we are retrieving data from external memory, and yet our brains are also working along with these external memory devices. There is definitely a different way of a wholly new system with new possibilities, okay, of storing knowledge, or even these things add to the way new knowledge is produced, right? So I'll end by looking at this slide. For instance, before the coming in of external memory, thought here was dependent on biological working memory, but after external memory, the situation has changed with the increased use of external symbolic storage. All these points are given to us by Donald. Then long-term store were accessible by means of limited associative strategies in the stage before external memory, okay, available to biological memory. But after the external memory systems, there was, as we said, a larger architecture within which the individual mind works. This has changed, right? And the structure of internal memory is now reflected in the external environment. So there is a larger field, as it were, to work with. And before external memory, finally, there was a need for oral mnemonics, and there was a need for for us to adopt different strategies, right, different shortcuts, because we are retaining things in our own memory, right. So there was also the need for specialized people like shamans, for instance, who were used, who had the task of preserving memory material. Not everyone. The work was divided in such a way that only some people were engaged in the task of storing memory. Well, and who knows, this may have been the first kind of division of labor, of mental labor and physical labor, right. Some were assigned the task of retaining things in their memory. But after external memory, what happened was an external memory field developed, okay, an external memory field which served as a real working memory for many mental operations. And there's also an external long-term store. The long-term store is not just no longer only inside our brains. There's also a huge external long-term store. You can also look at this from the point of view of the internet, for instance, not just storage devices like the hard disk, for instance. The entire in the world of data, a world of data is available to you through the internet. It's just as it says, at the click of a mouse you can access. It is because knowledge is growing so fast and there is so much to be retained that it is impossible. It is impossible for us to store everything in a limited memory system, right? And that is why we needed the written word, we needed those new storage devices, and this has also changed even physically, right, the way our minds work. Why? As Donald says, it is because we have a new environment here, where there is a symbiosis of the external and the internal memory systems. Therefore, an external memory system amplified the number and variety of representations available to us and increased the degree to which our minds share representations and rely on external devices for the process of thought itself. Look at this, it is so important for us to understand that even for the process of thought, or the processing of thought perhaps, has changed because of the availability of these external storage devices. Fine. So quickly, let's look at a few points here. If you get a question like, what is the human brain specifically adapted for? According to Donald, it is that the brain is adapted for functioning in a complex symbolic culture. Okay, it's important. Complex symbolic culture. Then, how did the evolutionary scenario proceed as far as humans are concerned? Now, the answer is this. We have to look at the evolutionary scenario as a series not simply of physical adaptations or changes, but as cultural adaptations. Why? Because the selection pressures that were there, even for the anatomy and physiology of the species, were ultimately expressed and were also tested. And I might add here that also the evidence comes from the socio-cultural level, right? Then what were the three major transformations in the story of the origin of the modern mind? The three major this is immensely important. Three major transformations. We have to be very careful so that we don't mix these. First transition had mimetic skill, where the whole body was used for representation, and it also had auto cueing, which we know was had a self-triggered rehearsal loop. You do not need any environmental cues, unlike apes. Okay, the memory is not episodic. We sort of developed, okay, a system called auto cueing, where we could recall memories at will. The second stage, we find that the most important thing was lexical invention, following, among other things, the descent of the larynx, anatomically speaking, which gave us a peculiar vowel triangle, right, in the shape of an inverted L, which gave us more repertoire, or a larger repertoire of vowel sounds, through which we could create new words and develop our lexicon. It also included a high-speed phonological system. Third is, as we saw just a while ago, the externalization of memory, which is a relatively new development. Okay, it is the last stage in the transition of of last transitional phase in the development of the modern human mind as compared to the evolutionary mind. Okay, so what we saw in our last lecture, okay, the argument in the last lecture for the point of view of culture was that all that we do, no matter what cultural arrangements we have, the fact remains that ultimately our mind is our minds are geared to solving old problems, okay, problems faced in our evolutionary past, which is 99% hunter-gatherer society, when you look at the time scale, right? But this Donald's essay, Donald's work, Donald's book tells us that there is a difference, particularly when you come to lexical invention and you come to the externalization of memory. We see that all these new things that we are able to do is because these changes have taken place. Okay, there is a narrative developmental story, if you will, okay, to this. But at the same time, the beauty is it doesn't do away what evolutionary psychologists have claimed, right? In the ultimate analysis, yes, we have these what we may call the deep structures, okay, the deep structures and our deep propensities, okay, for face recognition, for raising children, and for finding mates, etc. Right? Thank you so much, and we shall meet in the next lecture. Thank you.